When my successful brother saw a dead man dining across the room, he didn't panic. He confessed that their father's greatest secret was a failed attempt at immortality, and that he might be the next subject. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the loudest sound in our corner booth, a familiar, comforting rhythm that always accompanied a Friday night dinner with my older brother, Mark. We'd been doing this since I was old enough to steal the croutons off his salad, which admittedly was most of my childhood. Mark was the pragmatist, the successful financial analyst who always wore a crisp shirt, even on a casual night out. I was the perpetually struggling artist, clinging to the belief that ramen noodles were a viable food group. Tonight, we were at the Gilded Spoon, a ridiculously overpriced Italian place Mark insisted was worth the investment. He was meticulously cutting a piece of veal Milanese, his brow furrowed in concentration, while I was happily wrestling with a plate of slightly too garlicky spaghetti carbonara. The restaurant hummed around us, the low murmur of polite conversation, the distant melodic strains of a jazz trio tucked away near the bar. It was utterly mundane, perfectly normal. So, the gallery showing went, well, not badly, I finally offered, wiping my chin with a linen napkin that felt far too fancy for my usual wardrobe. Mark didn't look up immediately. Define not badly, Leo. Did you sell enough to cover the cost of the cheap Pinot Noir you drank while hanging the canvas? Or are we still subsidizing your existential crisis? He said it without malice, just characteristic dry wit. That was Mark. He grounded me, even if sometimes I felt like he was trying to pave over my spontaneous bursts of creativity with concrete spreadsheets. I sold 2 small pieces, and I got a commission, a portrait, of a prize-winning poodle, but still a commission. I beamed. Mark finally paused, setting his knife down with a quiet clink. He took a slow sip of his Barolo, his eyes the same deep hazel as mine, scanning the room, seemingly cataloging everything and nothing. See? Structure. Even abstract expressionism needs a budget, Leo. You need to stop treating finance like it's the enemy. It's easier to fight an enemy you can see, Mark, like our waitress, who is currently ignoring us while she chats up the sommelier. He chuckled, a rare, genuine sound that made the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white tablecloth. Speaking of seeing things, I saw an old acquaintance today. Remember David Hayes from our undergrad days? The theater major who always wore those absurd velvet vests? I snorted. The one who claimed he was channeling Laurence Olivier while pouring coffee? Hard to forget. Well, he's doing quite well now. Owns a small, very successful bespoke tailoring shop downtown. We had coffee. He asked after you, actually. Said he always admired your eye for color, even if you used it to paint things that looked like spilled paint buckets. I took a long drink of water. Mark was usually the one who brought up people from our past, often to compare their perceived success against my perceived meandering. I took a deep breath, preparing my usual defense mechanism, a self-deprecating joke, but I never got the chance. Mark's eyes had fixed on something across the room, past the potted olive tree separating us from the next table. His whole body went rigid, the kind of stillness you only see in predatory animals before they strike. His wine glass, halfway to his lips, stopped dead in the air. Mark? What is it? Did you see David Hayes again? Did he start reciting Shakespeare? I whispered, trying to follow his gaze, which seemed riveted on a man walking briskly towards the exit near the kitchen doors. The man was nondescript, dark suit, well-built, moving with an almost rehearsed haste. Mark didn't blink. His jaw tightened so fiercely I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. His knuckles, gripping the stem of the wine glass, turned snow white. He lowered the glass, slowly, deliberately, setting it down so gently it made no sound. His breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary intake of air that cut through the ambient noise. Then, louder than the muted jazz, louder than my own heart suddenly hammering against my ribs, Mark exploded. His voice cracked with a raw terror I had never heard him produce, a sound that instantly silenced the two surrounding tables. "No, impossible!" he roared, pushing his chair back so violently it scraped across the marble floor with a screech that made half the diners jump. He lunged forward, not towards the man by the kitchen, but towards the empty air just beyond the olive tree, his hand outstretched as if to physically stop something unseen. His face was ashen, slick with a sudden cold sweat. "It can't be you! You're not supposed to be here!" The collective silence that followed Mark's outburst was thicker than any velvet curtain. Several heads turned. Waiters froze mid-pour. Even the jazz trio seemed to hit a discordant, held note. Mark stood there, breathing hard, his chest heaving as if he'd just sprinted a mile. His eyes, wide and unseeing, were still fixed on the spot where the dark-suited man had vanished through the swinging kitchen door, but now he seemed to be looking through it, into something far more distant and terrifying. I shot out of my seat, my own heart racing, scrambling to cover for him. "Mark, what on earth—" I started, my voice a tight whisper of panic, praying he hadn't just launched into a very public, very expensive seizure. "Leo, sit down," he choked out, not looking at me. His voice was low now, strained, stripped of its usual authority. He pressed the palms of his hands flat onto the table, as if bracing himself against an internal earthquake. "Get down, now!" The tension in the room was palpable. A maitre d', sleek and unnervingly calm, was already gliding towards our table, a look of professional concern plastered on his face. "Sir, is everything all right here?" the maitre d' asked, his tone implying that, "No, it is not all right, and you are disturbing my clientele." Mark ignored him completely. He kept staring at the swinging doors, his gaze fixed. It wasn't just fear I saw in his eyes. It was utter, complete cognitive dissonance, like watching a perfectly ordered computer program suddenly attempt to divide by zero. "Leo, I need you to look at me," he commanded, finally tearing his gaze away from the kitchen entry. His hazel eyes met mine, and I saw a depth of desperation I hadn't witnessed since our father's funeral a decade ago. "Listen to me very carefully. Do you remember what I told you when we were kids? About the attic?" I frowned, confusion momentarily overriding my embarrassment. The attic. We grew up in a Victorian house that creaked like an old ship. The attic was boarded up after a minor electrical fire when we were teenagers. What about it? That it was dusty and full of Dad's old tax returns? No, what I told you not to do, remember. His voice was barely audible, forced past a throat that seemed to have suddenly constricted. "I told you, under no circumstances were you ever to touch the heavy oak trunk under the eaves. Ever." The maitre d' cleared his throat insistently. "Sir, if you require assistance, I can call—" "Shut up!" Mark snapped, turning his head with startling violence toward the manager. The sheer force of his anger, a complete departure from his normally controlled demeanor, made the maitre d' actually take a half step back. I placed a hand on Mark's arm, trying to gently pull him back toward the chair. "Mark, stop, you're scaring people. What does the trunk have to do with that guy leaving?" Mark flinched violently under my touch, pulling away as if burned. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. "That wasn't just a guy, Leo. That was impossible. That man was supposed to be dead. He's been dead for 15 years. My blood turned to ice. Dead. My brother was looking at a ghost, and he was reacting like he was looking at a firing squad. "Who, Mark? Who was that?" I demanded, leaning in close, trying to lower my voice while matching his intensity. The surrounding tables were now openly staring. We were the spectacle. Mark finally looked down at the uneaten veal, his manic focus shattering. He seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. He looked utterly defeated, yet still vibrating with residual terror. "It was Elias Thorne," he whispered. "The name from the trunk. The one Dad warned us about. The one whose belongings were sealed up with the house deed. Elias Thorne. The name was almost mythical in our family history, a dark chapter, something my father had always refused to discuss, only issuing that single bizarre command about the trunk before he died. I'd always assumed it was some forgotten rival or a disastrous business partner. Thorne died in that fire, Mark. We saw the report. We saw the memorial plaque at the old city hall, I insisted, trying to force logic back into the situation. Mark shook his head slowly once. He looked directly at me, and the look was devastatingly earnest. That's what we were told was in the fire, Leo. That's what we were told happened to him. But he wasn't supposed to be accounted for on any registry, not anywhere. He was supposed to be erased. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man suddenly looking faint. He wasn't looking at the kitchen anymore. He was looking down at his own hand, specifically at the thin gold signet ring he always wore, the one inscribed with our family crest. Leo, when I saw him, he looked exactly the same as he did in that faded photograph Dad kept hidden. 15 years older, maybe, but the same cold eyes. Mark's voice dropped to a near-silent rasp. And Leo, when he walked past, he didn't just leave. He glanced back at the table, and I saw it. I squeezed his arm, desperate for him to continue. My adrenaline spiked high enough to make my vision swim. Saw what, Mark? What did you see? Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive wine on his breath, mixing with the cold scent of panic. He wasn't wearing a tie, Leo. His collar was open, and across his throat, hidden partially by his shirt, was a thin, almost invisible scar. The exact scar that I got 2 weeks ago, when I was cleaning out the attic against Dad's explicit final wishes, trying to finally open that damned oak trunk. The dining room noise, which had momentarily faded into a low, buzzing hum of curious onlookers, seemed to rush back in, louder, more intrusive than before. My grip on Mark's wrist tightened automatically, feeling the tremor running through his bones. Elias Thorne, dead for 15 years, and yet Mark had just seen him, alive and well enough to walk through a busy restaurant with a scar that mirrored the one Mark had recently acquired from a mysterious accident in a forbidden attic. "A scar?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Mark, you sliced your neck on a loose nail while trying to pry open a rotten floorboard. It was a stupid, clumsy accident. You bled all over the carpet." Mark shook his head again, slow and resolute, his eyes boring into mine with terrifying sincerity. "No, the nail went in here." He tapped the left side of his throat just above the collarbone and pulled out here. He indicated the right side. "A clean, deep cut, Leo. It required 7 stitches. Thorne's scar, the one I saw, it was perfectly horizontal right across the center of his Adam's apple. It looked like a finished job." The maitre d' returned, this time accompanied by a very large, silent waiter who seemed to radiate passive aggression. "Gentlemen, I must insist. If you are not going to be seated, I need you to settle your check and vacate the premises. You are disrupting our dinner service." Mark's focus snapped back to the immediate threat, the potential scene, the need for discretion. He pushed away from the table, grabbing his wallet with surprising dexterity. He fumbled inside, pulling out a thick wad of bills, far more than the meal cost, and slapped them onto the table, completely ignoring the maitre d'. "We're leaving. Now," Mark hissed at me. He didn't wait for me to gather my meager belongings. He simply pivoted and strode toward the entrance, moving with the speed of a man fleeing an explosion. I scooped up my phone and keys, mumbled a hurried, inadequate apology to the bewildered staff, and practically sprinted after him. We burst out onto the busy city sidewalk, the cool night air hitting my face like a splash of ice water. The streetlights cast harsh yellow pools on the pavement. "Mark, wait, slow down," I called, jogging to catch up. He wasn't walking toward our usual subway station. He was moving fast, heading west, toward the older, less gentrified part of the city, where our childhood home stood, a solid granite monument to family secrets. When I finally caught up to him 2 blocks later, Mark had stopped under the glare of a flickering street lamp. He wasn't breathing heavily from the exertion. He was breathing hard from pure, unadulterated dread. "We have to go back to the house," he said, his voice tight. "We have to check the trunk." "Mark, what are you even talking about? That trunk has been locked since Dad died. You said you couldn't even get the hasp open last month." "I lied," he admitted, rubbing his temples with his free hand. "When I was up there last week trying to find the house deeds for the refinance, I didn't just get a splinter. I was prying at the lock on that trunk. I managed to force the hasp just enough to get a look inside before I sealed it back up. I only saw a sliver, but it was enough." "Enough of what?" I pressed, grabbing his shoulder again, this time with conviction. I wasn't going to let him bolt again. This wasn't just theater major gossip. This was Mark unraveling over something truly sinister. He looked up at me, and in the yellow light, his face seemed aged by a decade. Enough to know why Dad insisted we never open it. It wasn't full of old stocks or journals, Leo. It was full of evidence, and the centerpiece. The centerpiece was a leather-bound ledger, and on the cover, embossed in tarnished gold, was the same symbol that was engraved on the base of the antique silver cigarette case that Elias Thorne used to carry. My mind was reeling. A ledger, a symbol, a dead man Mark just saw walking, and a scar Mark mysteriously acquired while meddling with a forbidden heirloom. So Thorne is alive, and he's connected to whatever Dad locked away, I summarized, trying to build a rational structure around the chaos. "And you think he saw you, and now he knows you've been poking around what he left behind?" Mark nodded grimly. "Worse. I think he recognized me. Which means he wasn't just alive. He was hiding in plain sight. And if he's showing himself now, it means whatever Dad did to keep him buried, metaphorically or literally, it's failing." We hailed a cab, the ride back to the quiet, imposing house feeling like a descent into an abyss. The old Victorian loomed ahead, silent and judgmental under the moonlight. We didn't speak as we entered. The heavy oak front door seemed to sigh shut behind us, locking out the familiar world. We moved upstairs in a shared, urgent silence. The attic stairs groaned beneath our weight, a symphony of structural complaint. I held the flashlight while Mark, moving with a newfound, desperate energy, reached the sealed entrance to the attic space, a low, squat door reinforced with crude, old iron brackets. Mark pulled a heavy crowbar from a forgotten corner tool chest. He didn't hesitate this time. With 2 brutal, echoing swings, he smashed the wood around the latch. The brackets tore free, and the door swung inward, revealing the dusty, cobweb-draped space. The air that rushed out smelled like extreme age, dry rot, and something metallic, like old pennies. We climbed into the gloom. The single bare bulb Mark screwed into the overhead socket cast long, dancing shadows. There, right in the center under the eaves, was the target, the heavy, dark oak trunk, banded with tarnished brass. Mark knelt, positioning the crowbar under the lid, right near the damaged hasp. He looked back at me, his eyes blazing with fierce resolution. "If Thorne saw me, he knows I've seen the ledger," Mark breathed, bracing himself. "He's coming for us, Leo. He's coming for what's in this box." He leveraged the crowbar down with all his strength. The dry wood of the lid shrieked in protest, then splintered. The lid flew open with a deafening crack, releasing a final potent wave of that metallic, musty odor. I aimed the flashlight beam into the trunk's interior, expecting the ledger, expecting proof, expecting something concrete to hold on to. But the trunk wasn't full of books or documents. It was lined with thick, faded velvet, and resting dead center, taking up the entire volume of space, was one single pristine object. It was a human skull, and beneath it, lying against the velvet, was a small folded note, written in my father's unmistakable looping script. Mark reached for it immediately, his fingers brushing against the bone. As he unfolded the brittle paper, his eyes scanned the few lines written there, and the color drained from his face so completely I thought he might pass out right there on the dusty floorboards. "What does it say, Mark? What does it say?" I urged, shining the light directly onto the note. Mark let the paper drop, his hand recoiling as if stung by a snake. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the trunk, staring wide-eyed at the empty space where the skull rested. "It doesn't say anything about Thorn, Leo," Mark whispered, his voice catching on a sob. It says, the first one is back. Don't let him take the second." The brittle note fluttered down, landing softly against the unsettling white curve of the exposed skull. Mark didn't move to retrieve it. He remained frozen, halfway between the trunk and the attic doorway, his breath catching in ragged, painful gasps. "The first one is back? What does that even mean, Mark?" I demanded, shining the light from the dropped note up to the skull, then back to my brother's terrified face. The metallic scent in the air suddenly felt suffocating, thick with something ancient and wrong. "It means," Mark swallowed, his throat visibly working, "it means Dad didn't hide Thorn. He replaced him. He locked away the evidence that Elias Thorn never actually died, and he somehow created a false death certificate, a whole history. But if Thorn is alive, and he's showing up now, 15 years later, what does that mean for us?" I asked, feeling a cold dread creeping up my spine that had nothing to do with the dusty attic. This wasn't a family feud. This felt like an archaeological dig into something deeply buried and utterly malignant. Mark shook his head, his eyes darting around the cramped space as if expecting the walls to close in. "It means the structure Dad built to contain the secret is crumbling. And if Thorn is the first one, who is the second?" As if summoned by the question, a faint sound drifted up from downstairs, a sound that had no business being in our completely empty, locked-up house. It was the soft, distinct thud of the front door closing, followed by the familiar, rhythmic creak of the main staircase ascending. Someone, or something, was coming up. We froze. The single bare bulb above us swung gently on its frayed wire, making the shadows dance wildly. "Did you lock up when we came in?" I whispered fiercely. "Of course I did," Mark hissed back. "I double-bolted the deadbolt. Nobody could get in without a key, and only Dad and I knew where those were hidden." The footsteps were slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming for the attic. Mark scrambled backward until his spine hit the rough beams of the rafters. He grabbed the crowbar again, holding it not like a tool, but like a weapon of last resort. "Leo, get out, get down the stairs, go to the cellar, do whatever you need to do to get out of this house, now," he urged, pushing me toward the narrow gap where the door had been torn away. "I'm not leaving you here with a potentially homicidal ghost and a skull." The creaking stopped just outside the attic entrance. There was a pregnant pause, filled only by our ragged breathing. Then a voice, smooth, educated, and terribly familiar, drifted into the small space. "Such theatrics, Mark. And Leo, you always were the loyal one. I admire that. Loyalty makes things so much cleaner." It was Elias Thorne's voice, calmer now than in the restaurant, almost conversational yet utterly chilling. "How did you get in?" Mark shouted into the darkness below, his voice surprisingly steady now that the confrontation was imminent. A soft, dry laugh echoed up. "Oh, that old lock? Your father taught me far too much about bypassing simple mechanical barriers, Mark. He was a generous teacher for a time." Then a faint scraping noise. Thorn wasn't climbing the ladder. He was using something to secure the attic opening from below. "You shouldn't have disturbed the contents, Mark," Thorn continued, his voice layered with a strange, almost affectionate disapproval. "That trunk was designed to keep things in, not to keep people out." Suddenly the bare bulb flickered violently, sputtered once, and plunged the attic into absolute suffocating blackness. I cried out, instinctively reaching for Mark, but my hand met only cold, stale air. The only illumination now was the faint, sickly green glow emanating from the open trunk, the glow surrounding the skull. "Leo, Mark," I called out, my voice trembling violently. In the darkness, I heard a sharp, sickening thud, followed by a muffled cry of pain that was unmistakably Mark's. Then silence again, broken only by the faint sound of wood scraping against wood below, as if the attic door was being slowly, methodically closed and locked. I spun around blindly, trying to locate Mark, trying to get to the opening. My foot caught on something soft. Was it Mark's discarded coat? I stumbled, falling hard onto my knees, my flashlight beam skittering uselessly across the dusty floorboards. "Mark, where are you?" Then a shadow detached itself from the overwhelming blackness directly in front of me. It wasn't the heavy silhouette of Thorn. This shadow was leaner, quicker, and it moved with an aggressive certainty that felt horribly familiar. Before I could process the movement, something hard and sharp slammed into the back of my skull, precisely where I had hit the floor. But this impact felt targeted, deliberate, and utterly final. My vision dissolved into a violent kaleidoscope of pain. The last thing I saw just before the world went dark was the faint, greenish luminescence of the open trunk, and the smooth, leather-bound edge of the ledger, now inexplicably sitting outside the trunk, resting beside where Mark had fallen. And as consciousness slipped away, I felt a cold, dry hand gently close around my ankle. A breath, smelling faintly of ozone and very old dust, tickled my ear, and a voice, not Thorn's calm baritone, but a ragged, familiar whisper, spoke directly into my mind. "Welcome back, Leo. We have so much to catch up on." The darkness was absolute, a crushing weight that pressed against my eardrums. For a timeless interval, there was only the dull, rhythmic throbbing behind my eyes and the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I didn't know if I was dead, if I was dreaming, or if I was simply trapped in the instant before the final blow landed. Then, a noise cut through the void, not a creak or a scrape, but a sharp, decisive crack, like a thick pane of glass shattering under intense pressure. A searing white light flooded the attic, blinding me instantly. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my burning vision to adjust. When I could finally open them, I saw the source. Not a bulb, but the flashing red and blue strobes of emergency lights filtering through the grimy attic window. And Mark. Mark was standing over me, not the paralyzed wreck from the restaurant, but Mark restored, sweating, wild-eyed but functional. He was clutching the heavy crowbar, leaning on it like a crutch, his chest heaving. Next to him, the open trunk lay discarded, the skull still visible, but the eerie green light was gone. Leo, wake up! You have to wake up!" Mark shook my shoulders hard. I groaned, pushing myself up onto my elbows. My head was ringing, but the darkness hadn't been eternal. It had been interrupted. "What happened? Thorn?" I croaked, spitting out a mouthful of grit. Mark's eyes were wide with frantic relief, but also a deep, unsettling horror. He pointed toward the attic door, which now stood ajar, the rudimentary lock Thorn had placed shattered on the floor. "He was here. I saw him. He was right over you, the shadow," Mark whispered, his voice tight with adrenaline. "But then, the lights, the sirens. I heard your cell phone ringing downstairs, Leo. It must have been loud enough to carry." I vaguely remembered receiving a panicked text from my friend, Clara, when I hadn't answered her follow-up call about the poodle portrait. She must have seen the police cars converging on the street. The situation at the Gilded Spoon must have escalated beyond a simple disturbance. Did he hear the sirens? I asked, pushing myself to sit up fully. He reacted like burning sulfur hit him, Mark confirmed, his gaze fixed on the ruined lock. The moment those high-pitched sounds hit, the shadow vanished. He didn't run. He dissipated, like smoke. I crawled over to the trunk, ignoring the throbbing pain in my head. I looked at the note that had fallen from Mark's grip. It still lay there. The first one is back. Don't let him take the second. I picked up the note, and then my gaze fell on the ledger. The object Thorn had seemingly been chasing, the one that was outside the trunk when I was hit. I picked that up too. Mark, this ledger. The symbol on the cover matches the one on Dad's signet ring. What is it? Mark took a deep, shuddering breath, steadying himself against the rafters. When I forced the trunk open just before you came in, when I got that first glimpse, I saw the ledger and I knew I had to look at it. I didn't have time to read it all, but I flipped to the first page. It's not a ledger of finances, Leo. It's a journal. Dad's journal. What did it say about Thorn? Thorn wasn't Dad's rival, Leo. Thorn was Dad's creation. Dad was a brilliant, if eccentric, biochemist before he went into finance. In the 90s, he was obsessed with cellular regeneration. He was trying to achieve perfect, halted aging. Thorn was his first successful, stable subject. Mark tapped the ledger in my hand. He wasn't supposed to be a man. He was supposed to be immortal data. Thorn grew sentient, Mark. He developed a soul, or whatever you want to call it, and he wanted out. He wanted to live a real life. Dad tried to stop him, realizing the horror of what he'd made, but Thorn resisted. The fire? The fire was Dad's cover story. He killed Thorn, or thought he did, and sealed the evidence here, hoping to halt the process. But Thorn was never fully extinguished. He was stuck in a half-state, tethered to some energy source Dad built into the containment unit, which I'm guessing is what I inadvertently touched when I was prying at the lock last week. That's how I got the scar, the energy transfer, the backlash. I looked back at the skull. And this? Is this Thorn's skull? No, Mark said, his voice flat with sudden realization. Dad's note said, the first one is back. Elias Thorn is the first. This skull, this isn't Thorn. He pointed to the note again. Don't let him take the second. Thorn didn't come back for vengeance, Leo. He came back to reclaim his place, to reclaim what Dad took from him. My blood ran cold again. If Thorn was the first successful subject, and he was back to reclaim his place. I looked back at the skull, then down at the ledger, then to Mark, standing over me, pale, but fiercely protective. Mark, I whispered, the realization hitting with the force of the blow that felled me moments before. If Thorn is the first one, and you were scarred by the containment unit when you broke it open, then who is the second? Mark followed my gaze, his eyes locking onto his own reflection faintly visible in the tarnished brass of the trunk. He slowly raised his hand to his own neck, tracing the faint, barely visible white line that ran from his collarbone up toward his jaw. A tiny, almost invisible scar he'd always claimed was from a childhood shaving mishap. The second one, Mark breathed, his eyes widening as he finally understood the true, horrifying implication of his father's final warning. Was supposed to be me?